So, welcome. Thank you for coming to Health Central's ChalkTalks panel discussion on wellbeing in the workplace. We're delighted you could all be here. I'm Jude Barback. I'm the editor for Health Central and actually the education and health editor at NZME. I look after a number of health and education titles and platforms, including Health Central and also Education Central. Health Central's been around for about 18 months now, and it's a platform for health-related content, features, news. Our latest addition to the team is our ChalkTalks brand, and it's a foray into taking content off the page, as it were, and into live debate. So that's what the ChalkTalks is all about. We like to keep it fairly intimate and with the focus being on our video content, and so do follow us afterwards on Health Central. Our last ChalkTalk was on euthanasia, the assisted dying legislation. So I was quite looking forward to tonight being a slightly lighter topic, a bit more positive in nature. Although I do say that with some caution, because I think there's a tendency to treat wellbeing slightly a fluffy topic. Mindfulness apps on your phone and Pilates at lunchtime. But delving into it a little bit further with some research, there's a lot more to it, as you'll know, and it's probably why you're here tonight to talk about it. I want to talk about wellbeing too in the context of the workplace tonight, and so we've honed it into that. To do so, we have an excellent panel prepared for you. I'm rather chuffed with myself for rallying such a fine bunch of troops, and let me just introduce them to you now. So we've got Bevan Catley here, is Associate Professor at Massey University, based up in Auckland, and Bevan is the co-founder for the Healthy Work Group. Beside Bevan, we have Terry Buckingham. Terry is the Health and Wellbeing Manager for Fonterra, New Zealand. Beside Terry, we've got another Jude, two Judes tonight, you're very lucky. Jude Ehrlich, and Jude joins us. Jude's the General Manager for Strategy and Engagement from WorkSafe. Beside Jude, we've got Alex Beattie. Alex is Social Media and Wellbeing Researcher at Victoria University of Wellington. And last but not least, we've got Alistair Duncan, who's an Industrial Leader at the Union Etu. So could we just give our panel a big warm round of applause. So I don't intend to stand all night because it's about wellbeing and I'm in my heels. So without further ado, let's kick things off. Now I've got some pre-prepared questions here, but I would invite our audience to participate in this discussion. Obviously not talking over one another, but if we could just raise your hand and we'll endeavour to get questions discussed as we go along. Similarly, panellists, if you just indicate to me if you want to jump in on a certain topic, that would be great. But let's start with a fairly broad question. And Bevan, perhaps we'll start with you. So why wellbeing and why now? We've got the wellbeing budget next week. We've got wellbeing surveys happening in schools. Why is it more on our radar now than before?
So I guess the first part is, well, why not? So, I mean, if we're thinking about wellbeing, and I might have plagiarised this from someone in this room, but if we think of what's the opposite of wellbeing, right, that's stress and uncool stuff. So why wouldn't we want to be in the wellbeing game? And I think we're seeing, there's plenty of evidence both from regulators and the researchers around, the harm that work can have on individuals, and clearly that's not cool. And New Zealand has some pretty awful stats around harm in the workplace, both in terms of physical harm and psychosocial harm. So why wouldn't we want to be in the wellbeing game?
So some of your research has been in this space, and we talked a little bit about it earlier. Could you maybe highlight for the audience some of the trends that has come out of that research in terms of the New Zealand Workforce Barometer survey?
Yep.
Was it?
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, one of the things that we seem to be very good at is bullying. And we have now a number of pieces of research in the New Zealand context which indicate, both in particular industries and across samples of the New Zealand workforce, that bullying rates are pretty high. And we've found rates anywhere up to between about 12 and 18%. That's a lot of our colleagues who are experiencing a pretty crappy time at work from bullying, and it's well documented that bullying has really negative effects on people, and also those who witness bullying. So it's not just about those who experience bullying, but it's also the colleagues around who see this going on. And even in our most recent workplace barometer, which has 2018 data, we still picked up 12% of a sample of 1,400 employees that was drawn from across 25 organisations. The other finding that really is giving us cause for concern is something like 27, I think, % of that sample reported significant levels of depression. And that's got to be a concern.
Absolutely. I mean, let's talk about bullying, though, for a second, because obviously we're all aware of the Francis Review findings have been released recently, finding bullying and harassment rife in Parliament. Jude, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think we'd find the same in lots of workplaces around New Zealand?
Yeah, it's, firstly, just to comment on that Francis Review, that was a positive step for an employer or group of employers to seek to identify the hazard and work with the workers to identify some solutions. And I think it's really important, for other employers to start to think and grapple with what might at first seem quite a scary topic for them, or one that's quite heavily loaded. But employers generally, I think, are starting to develop a bit more maturity in this space. The kind of harm we're seeing in WorkSafe is doing quite a bit of research and supporting researchers. So I'm pleased to say we're going to be working with you on the barometer going forward. We've recently done, through Massey University actually, have done a deep dive into 7 occupational groups to try and understand what's going on there. And it's quite interesting because of the samples involved there, some of the bullying is looking like, up to half in one particular occupational area. And interestingly, not all that bullying is happening by what you'd think. You'd probably think it's your workmates or your bosses, right? A lot of it is also coming from customers. And so that's starting to tell us, New Zealand, we have a culture problem, quite deep. We're seeing it in schools, right? And it's playing out at workplace. I'm
just sorry to jump in here. I just was curious for Alistair's views on this coming from the union perspective. I know you do a lot of work with the care and support sector. Do you think that Jude's comments about the customer-facing side of it rings true for those?
That's certainly a case. Right now we are in a series of negotiations with some very large providers, and consistently staff talk to us about what they want to do is spend more time supporting service users, supporting consumers, supporting residents, and the biggest problem they face is simply not enough staff to do that, so the quality of care is diminished. But I thought it was worth reflecting on where we find ourselves in New Zealand in 2019 in terms of what legislative levers have we inherited from the 1980s and the 1990s about work. Because in the 1990s, New Zealand became the most deregulated workforce in the country. We simply removed all reference to workers' rights from our legislation. And what came back in 2000 is still well below the OECD average. But it's interesting, one of the things that the Employment Relations Act, which governs, for those of you waged or salary people here tonight, governs all your work. Parliament did a very strange course. They said that we should acknowledge, and it was a term that everybody had to learn, good faith in employment relations. And everybody now, it rolls off the tongue. But I can remember sending it back in about 1999, 2000, when we all didn't say good faith and sent an email saying goof faith. Because good faith can often be don't make mistakes. But it's interesting if you look at the Act, Jude. The Act says this about the workplace, that the objects of the Act are to acknowledge and address the inherent inequality of power in employment relationships. So whether this is sexual harassment, whether this is bullying, whether this is poor behaviour, this is about power and power challenges. And New Zealand is a country where largely most workers do not have a collective voice in bargaining, and that surely diminishes the power that we can share in the community.
Thank you. Terry, do you have any thoughts on that coming from a different angle from Fonterra's perspective?
Yeah, I think, Fonterra, and I need to be clear, I'm not necessarily a spokesperson for Fonterra, but from our perspective, I guess I could say that we're like any other organisation in New Zealand. None of us are immune to it, right? None of us are immune to harassment and bullying in our organisations, and if we think we are, we're probably kidding ourselves. So we're really just, working in a New Zealand environment with 11,500 employees, no different from any other organisation. So we're obviously having to tackle those issues as well. And I think the key thing that we're working on is what is not only our good faith, responsibilities, but what's our duty of care to our people, not only kind of from our leaders to our staff, but also our staff to each other.
So you're saying wellbeing has to be, any approaches have to be a holistic system.
Yeah, and a top-down and bottom-up approach as well, so that everybody wins at the end of the day. And
so what does that look like in practice? I mean, it sounds, it's an easy thing to say, holistic, it's an easy word to say, but what does it look like for in say, a company like Fonterra?
I guess the way it plays out is often in programs, for example, where our staff will come to us with a great idea or something they've got that they think will be really good to run with staff, and we'll use that energy, I guess we'll use that momentum to then explore the idea further with other staff and other stakeholders, key stakeholders within the business, and then grow it from there. We're often very good at grassroots stuff, very Fonterra term, but grassroots stuff, developing stuff from the ground up, rather than that kind of top-down approach of saying, okay, you guys, this is what you need to look after your health and wellbeing.
I came across a beautiful story, I'm not sure if anyone else did, reported on by Radio New Zealand, about a disabled man in his 30s who had to stay up to see the tanker come every night. And the Fonterra workers took it upon themselves what Fonterra did, to change the whole tanker run for Te Rapa, I think it is, in Hamilton. And they gave him a vest, and they gave him a model tanker and even a bike. They raised money from all around the world. I mean, that strikes me as a very positive example of dealing with your customer in a way that promotes well-being. Is that a grassroots approach, or is that part of the culture? I mean, how do you get that?
Yeah, and I think to expand on that, I think well-being in the workplace has expanded in its kind of definition now that we actually talk about well-being going beyond Fonterra and going into the community, working with our farmers, working with our community to actually bring about collective well-being, I guess. We wouldn't say we've got it perfect. But what we would say is that we're starting to do things like that now that are actually having an impact on our communities, but also our customers or our stakeholders, our owners, for example.
Yep, great. So, I mean, if you said we haven't got it perfect. I mean, is there ever an end point for wellbeing in the workplace? I mean, Bevan, in your research, is it pointing to a sort of a gold standard, as it were, in terms of wellbeing? And if so, how do we start to get on that right track towards?
So for us, I mean, we absolutely endorse what Terry was saying about having a systems approach. So one of the things in terms of bullying that we know from the research is the work environment is a really influential antecedent. That's not to say it's the only thing, and that individual factors are not important, but the work environment is very, very important. And you've got interpersonal factors and the situational factors. And so for us, what we would advocate is exactly that, is that, focusing on the work environment and committing to addressing, suboptimal work and, workplace factors. So making sure that you've got the things, you've got role clarity, that people have got enough resources to do their job. They've got they can cope with the demands. And that the other thing that we're advocating is developing competent managers and management competencies. There seems to be an indication that partly why I think we might have the issues that we do in New Zealand, why we have high rates of bullying, might be linked to a lack of management competencies. Our thinking is that what we're really good at is promoting the technical competencies So managers get to a position that they have, or get into a position to be able to apply for a management job because of their technical competencies. They're a really good researcher, they're a really good nurse, or what have you. But when they actually come to their management role, those technical competencies become less important. It's the interpersonal competencies, and what we more would like to see is a continued investment in those interpersonal competencies. You know, there's some good work out of, for example, out of the UK Health and Safety Executive that's empirically based around developing everyday management competencies that go addressing things like stress. So the argument is if you have develop these everyday competencies in managers, things like stress and bullying become less likely to get a foothold.
So I'm interested in anyone's views on this. I mean, is it possible to develop these, or do you simply have innate interpersonal qualities and that make you a good leader or manager? Or can a person with the technical skills that Bevan's talking about develop these interpersonal soft skills, if you like, to make them fit for the job? Anyone?
Well, I want to pick up the point about the extent to which cultures are shaped by the norms of society, and norms are informed by the rules and the regulations, be they explicit in terms of statute or implicit in terms of how we deal with each other. And in the workplace, we still are a massively deregulated workplace, and that's the challenge of saying, do you do this by evolution on a site-by-site, or do you in fact say, if we see a faulty piece of machinery, there's likely to be a regulation to deal with it. If we see a faulty piece of management, whose responsibility is that to correct it? And that's the challenge.
Do you think it's a challenge that needs to be addressed company by company, or do you think we need some more overarching guidance on this at a...
Certainly from a union perspective, what we want to do is we want to have responsibilities that are clear and agreed and enforceable. Otherwise, you're going to be dealing on an ad hoc case-by-case basis. And standing up must be damn difficult. As those women at Russell McVeigh found, you know, there's hell to go through. And unless there's a structure around dealing with those things, we can't rely on self-management. Z Energy doesn't self-manage its stuff. It's got procedures and policies. Fonterra, chock full of health and safety regulations. But when it comes to interpersonal dealings, it's, that's a bit different.
I would say, to answer your question again, it's more caught than taught, those skills.
Right.
So in other words, you know, there really does need to be an appetite for people to learn those interpersonal skills, those softer skills, I guess you could say. And if you don't want to know any of those skills, or you're not open to learning those skills, then you won't necessarily work well in that area. And pick up on your point around those technical skills. You know, they really need to be built upon, right, those interpersonal EQ skills. And I don't think there's necessarily any right fit for a leader or anything like that. In other words, you know, leaders basically teach themselves in a lot of ways, and they pick up on things and are open to those skills. And I think that's important, that people are open to learning those sort of skills.
But things can be, you know, there are techniques for dealing, you know, having difficult conversations, for you know, managing time, for being proactive, for, you know, those skills that come under that broad set of interpersonal. So there are some stuff that people can, you know, be taught and given some techniques and tools to you know, to make themselves a more competent manager.
Jude, from the WorkSafe perspective, are you finding that there's more emphasis, or as much on, so a lot of what you do is probably around health and safety policies, but at the same time you're working on developing these interpersonal skills in businesses? How does that all fit together?
So I think, you know, the evidence is pretty clear, and in fact I was just looking at a McKinsey article from, I think it was November last year, demonstrating a clear connection between organisations that score highly on what you might call organisational health and the amount of injuries that occur in the workplace. And the health connection includes really critical pieces, which I think sort of touch in this space. It's about values and culture within the organisation, having a very clear leadership stance. And when you are addressing anything in a health and safety context, leadership, critical risk, so identifying, knowing what they are, worker engagement are three key parts of the package. And getting that worker voice is absolutely essential. It's as essential as having that right leadership. And so much of our guidance and support is really around in that space. I'm just mindful you haven't said anything yet.
I was just going to ask
I
for
sort of
Alex.
feel like I'm hogging it.
No, I was going to actually ask Alex how that worker voice plays out in with social media playing into that space, in terms of giving workers a voice and platform. Is it a...
Does social media give workers a voice? Absolutely. Social media can be incredibly empowering. Social media can also be incredibly distracting. It's a tool and it can go either way. And so I'm not a fan of organisations that monitor or restrict social media. I think any organisation that wants to build culture, wants to build a sense of connectedness and belonging within its organisation, social media is an instrumental means to that end. You know, the water cooler now belongs online. You know, people are talking about the latest Game of Thrones episode, not around an actual water cooler, but on Gmail or Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And so, you know, I'm a believer that organisations should support channels for workers to connect with each other in that way.
If it's not monitored, is there not the risk that the bullying that we touched on earlier can creep in through social media avenues, as we're seeing in our schools? You know. Yep.
And so my take on bullying is this, and I'm coming from a tech perspective, so I'm not trying to claim to be a wellbeing expert at all. But you know, bullying in person can be awful, but the memories of it can pass. The difference with cyberbullying is that it's captured in code, and you can't sometimes escape from that hurtful comment that stays online. For me, and this means that a hurtful comment can then therefore enter into a different channel and can bleed into the home space, and that kind of awful memory of work can follow you home. This is why I'm more of an advocate of creating clearer boundaries between work and home, rather than monitoring social media at work. And so I think there are rules and practices that can both promote a clearer distinction between work and leisure.
But isn't there a movement towards the whole person management, where we bring our whole selves to our work, so we don't leave our happy... I have a busy morning with my kids at home, and then I go to work and I drop all of that and I forget I just do my work. I mean, that's not how we work. Surely social media is an extension of that to a degree?
It is, but the risk is with flexible working, we also never stop working. And I think we're just starting to understand the costs of that now. And yes, flexible working is the only option for some people who have children or who need to work remotely or have global clientele, and so they have to work over the weekends. But that doesn't mean we can still try and problematise and understand what the costs are. And there's a reason why certain companies overseas are playing with this idea of the right to disconnect, not having to respond to work-related communication after hours, or email servers being shut down so people don't have to respond. It's because it's related to burnout and stress and anxiety.
I'm curious about the findings of those trials, or, I mean, did they find that people cram more work into the time that they're at work, or are we less productive at work because we know we've got the evenings to tinker on our emails? Not speaking from experience.
Generally, if you give people a space where this is work time, this is home time, people will generally work more during work time, and they will generally focus on other life things outside of work. Right.
Because I'm curious on the panel's thoughts about the 4-day working week. And I believe, was it Perpetual Guardian has trialled it, and they're fans. However, a University of Auckland study looked into it and found that some of the workers found that they felt stressed because they had to do more in the time they were at work. So is it one of these situations where it's not a one-size-fits-all? We need to allow workers the freedom to be connected if they want, or do we truly think it's better to disconnect?
We talk about work being a support place, right? You're better at work, right? We know that worklessness, for example, is bad for your health, so the inverse is true. But I guess for a lot of people, their work is very much part of their being, right? I know that your work that you do, for example, Bevan, is very much the core of who you are. and you identify with it that strongly. And I think we all do in some way, shape or form get support from work, right? And our work colleagues are actually, if we admit it, just as important to us as some of our families. And some people who live alone, for example, might need work for that support. We know that, for example, when people are rehabilitating and you take them out of the work environment for more than 3 months, it's very hard to rehabilitate them or bring them back to work. In fact, 70% of them don't return after 3 months absence from work if they've been away for that long period. So there's real advantages in, I guess, making the best use of that support network at work.
A couple of reflections on that, Jude. New Zealand was the first country in the world to legislate for the 40-hour week. I suspect half the audience would love to work a 40-hour week, and half the audience will have checked their phone at some point during this presentation just in case something happened. And the best example of that, if you're ever on those flights that arrive at Wellington Airport at about 6 or 7 o'clock, the minute the light comes on, the phones are out and we're checking them left, right and centre. But who actually has those options? Perhaps in the insurance sector. Look at the service sector. Look at the retail sector. I'm old enough to remember when you had to do your shopping on Friday night because the shops were shut. And we've accepted the laissez-faire approach to everything's got to be available. And certainly in the area that I'm involved with, the care and support area, it's a 24/7 industry. But on the same day that we lost the 40-hour week, we lost the statutory right to paid overtime on the weekend. Right. And we do need, and I'm of that generation now where I'm increasingly interested in the quality of aged care from a personal point of view. It's become the fastest growing business in New Zealand that us taxpayers underwrite corporate profit. Those workers are not going to get a 4-day week option. And we do have to be very careful when they see those fabulous stories about somebody who works from the farm and the biggest worry is have they got good internet reception, with actually the vast bulk of working people in the service economy. Talk to a farmer about a 4-day week and they'll tell you which way's up.
I grew up in a dairy farm myself, so I can vouch for that.
I think that's a really important point that we're touching on here. It's around job design, and poor job design can lead to impairment, which can lead to injury. It can lead to the stress and anxiety, poor mental health, and so on. So for the employer, they are responsible for managing the job design, which is also linked into where we started with, management skill, right? That's something that's within the, it's a reasonably practicable thing to do for an employer to use the language of the legislation is, have I got the job design right? What is the impact of this job design, hours of work, the way in which work is interconnected and handed off and so on. How is it having an impact on the well-being of my workers? How is the competency of my leadership, my management, affecting the well-being of my workers? They're all questions very reasonable for an employer to ask of themselves.
So what you're saying, Jude, is that well-being in essence is underpinned by the nuts and bolts of our jobs, the fundamentals of our working. Would you agree to?
Yeah, I think it's foundational, right?
Yeah.
And you can have any health and wellbeing program has to be built on a foundation of good work.
Yeah.
So that comes down to things like pay equity. Alistair, I'm looking at you because I've talked a lot about this.
It comes down to pay equity, and I do encourage people to have a look at the bill as reported back. I think women are going to have to fight very hard to deliver on the promise of the 1972 legislation. But on the issue of pay, perhaps not this building, but the women, and largely women who are cleaning office blocks tonight all around Wellington, let's put some historical perspective there. In 1990 they were paid 24% above the minimum wage. Today they're paid 25 cents above the minimum wage. We've seen a hollowing out and a devaluing, and we went through it in aged care until the Christine Bartlett case delivered for them. But we look at other feminised occupations, and the audience here, there's a long, long way to go for support staff, for cleaning staff, for laundry staff, for kitchen staff, for retail workers. And driving here, I was listening to the afternoon chat show and they were asking you what was your favourite whine about a cafe, go and ask those people who are working in the cafes about pay there. It's not all trendy, hip barista stuff. It's really tough and difficult. We've got a long way. We've fallen a long way.
Good point, Alistair. But what strikes me here, though, is that I think stress, fatigue, mental health issues that are creeping in, they seem to be affecting every level of the organisation and in every sector. I don't think there's anyone that's immune from these sorts of problems in the workplace. How much onus is there on the individual to take responsibility for those issues in a work, and how much is on the employer?
So, obviously the employer has a legal duty to to provide a safe workplace, which, and part of that is for managing, what I would term unreasonable stress and fatigue, because there are obviously times in our work we all, get put under pressure and get tired, and that's different from what we're talking about stress and fatigue, which is as a result of, many cases of, as you said, poorly designed work, etc., etc., etc. But employees also have, their obligations to take, reasonable care of themselves and others around. So that they have their obligations. I would also say that, but from what we know about stress and fatigue, again, we keep coming back to job design and management competencies. Who's in the best position to influence the way work is organised, managed and designed? Those in the management structure. So they're going to potentially have more ability to influence, the design of work. That doesn't mean that they're the only people, but they're more chance to influence.
What does the research say about people having some autonomy, or some more say perhaps in their own job design and work, and the effect of and the impact of that on mental health and well-being at work?
Likely to be a predictive factor.
Right. Okay.
It's interesting. Health, isn't it, is very personal to us, isn't it? Your own health is very personal to you, and I think more and more we're actually taking a collective responsibility for our health. If I would say to this audience, is safety everybody's responsibility, what sort of show of hands would I get? Just briefly. Oh. Yeah, so what about health? Is that everybody's responsibility? Do I get the same show of hands? I think I've got an enlightened audience. But I think what happens is people hold their own health very personal to them, and it's tied up in cultural beliefs and even religions at times. And so what we often find is that health means different things to different people, and sometimes we're quite private about our health, aren't we? And we don't bring it to work, and we don't want to talk about it, and we don't then seek others and support from others.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm getting at there is that we are starting to open up more with each other as New Zealanders to start to seek support not only from our family but from our colleagues at work as well. And I think that's a good thing. I think in safety we've been through that kind of evolution, would it be fair to say, in WorkSafe? But we've got some way to go in health in terms of taking collective responsibility for our health.
Alex, do you think there's a space for social media to take more of a role there and advance those conversations from Games of Thrones to talking about our mental health? I mean, are we starting to see that more as a society?
If you find yourself scrolling on your phone without thinking, opening up Facebook or Instagram or Twitter without thinking, or if your child or your cousin or whatever, someone you know does that, it's very easy to blame the person and say, oh, they have low impulse control, they have a compulsion, they have an embarrassing habit. And that sometimes is where a lot of the conversation goes to. But what I talk about in my workshops is there's only one of you in front of one side of the screen. And on the other side of the screen is hundreds of psychologists and behaviourists who are trying to addict you to that service. And social media and big tech has a big problem with the way they design their platforms. Facebook is designed to be used all the time. Instagram is designed to be used all the time. YouTube is designed to be used all the time. The interface of Netflix is the same. And so the problem of big tech is wider than this conversation just around wellbeing, and they have a lot to own and be responsible for. And unfortunately, it's going to take a long time to probably hold them to account, because the question of whether social media is addictive is hugely problematic as well. We can prove that one cigarette is bad for you. I cannot prove that 5 minutes on social media is bad for you, because it can be used for things that are really empowering. So this is a conversation that we'll probably still be having in 10 years' time.
Yeah.
But I do want to underline that big tech has a lot to be responsible for, and in the sort of short to mid, well, more the mid to long term, we may see more ethical, better ways of designing these platforms to make them less addictive, to make them less habitual. And I'd like big tech to own that. And unfortunately, all we have in the meantime is things that we can do ourselves individually, and to look after ourselves and undertake self-care and to disconnect and go for a walk, meditate if that's for you, maybe go look at some birds. I love to bird watch. That's not the only option. We do need to hold these platforms to account.
This is where I think it sometimes we fall down in our businesses, because, and I know I'm going to get myself in trouble with the NZME, but there's a Facebook equivalent that you're encouraged to be part of, and I feel like my life is too busy to really engage in a social media platform for work, so I don't. And at times I think, oh goodness, I should be doing that. Do you think that many people would resonate with that feeling of like, I should be engaging? It's like forced engagement through social media, and that feeling that they should be, otherwise they're not doing well at their job.
I read a book about 5 years ago that I really enjoyed. It was called Quiet by a lawyer called Susan Cain, and it's a book for introverts, and it was a book that argues that the modern workplace is designed for extroverts. The whole idea of the open office plan is designed for people who work best in teams, that can work in an open environment and bounce off other people. And actually, for a third of the Western population, we're actually better at working by ourselves, and we are most creative when we're by ourselves. And by encouraging people to be social and to test it on social media, I think you are reinforcing that kind of privilege for extroverts. So I would like organisations to recognise that some people actually best work by themselves in solitude or privately.
That's a really good point, because I know in the education sector we're having this very debate about modern learning environments and whether they are good for all learners, and I feel like that could be an argument and debate that certainly needs to be had. Is there much research happening in that space, Bevan, that you're aware of in terms of, we talked about job design, but what about physical workplace design? Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting because we're having this debate at work about the layout of the School of Management premises down in Palmerston North, and exactly this. Do we have, the arguments for having open planning like this versus the argument for everyone being in their office? And I think, what you're saying, really did resonate. I'm certainly not an expert on this literature, but I know there's plenty of research debating the merits of open plan versus offices, and I'm sure it varies from industry to industry. And I mean, certainly researchers, we're not, academics are not renowned for their social skills, and
I think you're an exception to the rule there.
Well, maybe, and and it's good times when you put a bunch of academics together, and often they are best in an office and locked away and the light closed. So again, I think it comes back to thinking about, well, what are you trying to achieve with it? What's the whole point of putting people in? What are you actually trying to do? What's the point? And I'm not entirely sure that's always clear, or we're just doing it because it's cheaper.
Right. Yeah.
So what are the drivers of what it is that you're trying to do?
Yes, absolutely. So, junction out. If anyone's got any burning questions for our audience, for our panel, yes.
I wanted to just ask the difference or conflict between self wellness and this whole drive to self, and how that will bode in the workplace for the commitment and responsibility to your workplace, your colleagues and your clients. Because it's all very well to be self-aware and working on your self-wellness, but you're going to be in a really hard boat in the old age facility, because your 20-year-old caregiver is not going to turn up because her boyfriend had a fight with him. So this is where I'm saying, where are we
the interface
drawing
between
the line or interfacing? It isn't, wellness in the workplace is important, but it's that balance of commitment and the wellness of the team, the group, the business.
It's a really good question.
Views on that?
Who would like to take that, Jude?
I think at the heart of effective work, good work, is that the supervisor or manager, whoever's the person with that responsibility, needs to know who the workers are, and we talked a bit about, you mentioned the whole person there. That is a skill that is needs to grow more in our community. We hear words like diversity. Interestingly, diversity might be something I'm very happy to have happen over there. In my team, do I know who my workers are? Do I know what makes them tick? Do I know that they are needing some support to manage some difficult family situations right now? Do I have, and are they aware of, access to employee assistance programs? Do I validate the cultural needs of my workers? Do I understand them? Do I even know they exist? So at the heart of it is kind of where we sort of started right at the beginning. There's still a responsibility to have effective management and leadership practices. And I just want to kind of add one other layer. I really think, in connecting back to this idea about having conversations and using multiple channels, you need to engage workers in these conversations. It's their well-being. The workers are at the heart of the government's health and safety at work strategy. The whole of our society needs to stand up and take some responsibility and start having a conversation about our society. We have road rage, supermarket rage, domestic violence, bullying at work. What is that telling us?
Lack of a framework and structure.
What's happening in schools? So, as a society, we need to talk about it.
I know that 20-year-old, although in aged care she's probably 53, and the first test will be, because he is useless, that boyfriend, and she should have dumped him years ago, the first test will be how she's received by the person on the end of the phone. Oh my God, we're short-staffed, Sally and Jane can't come. Are you sure? The next test will be the economics for her. Has she got a couple of kids and she's used up her sick leave? Is she getting more than the statutory minimum sick leave? So all those underpinning structural issues are going to inform, because in fact, when she does ring, she's probably going to come into work, because there's going to be a combination of responsibility to guilt somewhere on that spectrum that brings her in there. And I suspect it goes beyond the areas of work that I'm familiar with, that in terms of, whether it is those poor benighted businessmen on the Koru Hour flight needing to check the stock exchange in New York. I mean, those are the work-life balance so badly out of kilter.
Any other questions? Yes?
Yeah, I'm interested in, as a country we have an ageing population, and what we're doing to prepare and accommodate for our lack of preparation, that we will be living a lot longer than we planned for and working potentially longer than we planned for.
Who would like to take that one about the ageing population?
Well, I just add to the question really some information that older workers and younger workers tend to be overrepresented in some of our injury statistics. So it does become increasingly important.
Yes, I can add, we have this term called the digital divide. It differentiates between people who have regular access to the internet and people who don't. And sometimes we also use the term to describe people who know how to use digital media and the internet, and those that don't. And people who are older typically fall on the wrong side of the divide. And so teaching digital literacy skills to an ageing population, I think, would be really important. So people who choose to, who want to keep working can, in a job market that's changing at a pace that we've probably never experienced before.
that was one of the pre-budget announcements, I believe, that digital literacy for older people. To what extent do we think that government has a role in all of this, and in terms of funding some of these ideas that we're talking about, or does it rest solely on the heads of the individual sectors and companies like Fonterra? What do we think?
I think it's a shared care kind of approach, really, that we provide, I guess, the environment and the job design to allow people to continue to work, but also, you know, to look at their work and do they want to work full time, or do they want to work part time? Do they want to mentor others, and do they want to leave the ladder down for others and give them that opportunity to, you know, to work with some of our youth to be able to pass on some of their skills and some of the experience that they've had in their work. And I think that is a challenge for business, but also for government to perhaps work together on that to provide those opportunities. I don't know if I have the answers, but I think we're going to definitely need it. So I take your point. I think we're going to need to work together on that to find solutions, and I don't think it will be a one-size-fits-all approach. We'll have to work with individuals to tailor and target things that are actually going to work for those individuals. Yeah.
So we've been doing a little bit of work in the area around older workers, in particular around attitudes towards older workers, and one of the things that we've, I guess, trying to see change in is around attitudes towards older workers, and that and recognise and that there's significant value in older workers. Just because you hit whatever the arbitrary number is that suddenly you're less valuable. And getting employers to recognise, to go back to harp on about job design, is that you also need to be flexible in job design. So job design, where you might have an employee, at one end of the spectrum in terms of age, at the other, might change because of, things change when we become older, and that we may need to change the way that job is organised and designed to accommodate, an older workforce.
Those are lofty, decent things to say, but let's also look at the reality of capital. Businesses under the Companies Act are charged with a responsibility under the Companies Act. I'm old enough to remember when KFC first came to New Zealand. Some of you might be. 2 of the 11 secret herbs and recipes, one was salt and one was pepper, apparently. But if you look at KFC, it used to employ part-time, married, provincial and suburban women in those jobs. The minute the government legislated for youth rates, they were suddenly employing 16 and 17-year-olds. So we can't leave it to the market. And in this little city-state of New Zealand with 4 million people, if we don't have structural community support, then we're going to see that hollowing out. We used to be, was it 14th in the OECD ratings of decency? And now we're below Turkey.
Do we have any? Yes?
We talk about fatigue in the stress and fatigue in the workplace earlier, which made me think about issues around fatigue and drivers, which then brought me on to thinking about people who work for themselves. So truck drivers often work for themselves but are contracted through the larger companies. I don't know if that's the model at Fonterra, I'm not sure. So they are under huge pressure to get the goods to market or whatever, but there's no one actually managing their stress. They're the ones that have to manage their stress. So how does that fit into all of this?
I think that's a question for me. We have 1,600 tanker drivers in Fonterra, and we do use some contractors from time to time. Stress and fatigue is definitely something that we have a duty of care around. Fatigue, we do a lot of work with our drivers around fatigue, helping them understand what fatigue is to start with, around awareness of fatigue, and sleep opportunities, good shift work, good work that we kind of mentioned before around job design and things, but getting good sleep opportunities at home, lifestyle factors as well, eating, drinking well. But at the end of the day, I think what you're hitting on there is that there are some industries, like the transport industry, for example, where there are inherent risks, right? They have a 13-hour logbook, many truck drivers, and some companies would see that 13 hours as a target rather than, a limit. And I think there's a real opportunity there for us, I guess, to work with industry to help, I guess, bring in some of those practices that we think are, fairly basic, but actually are fundamental to preventing stress and fatigue.
Are we seeing that collaboration across sectors, across industries?
Yeah, we are. We are members of that transport industry, and obviously our transport team and management team are working within that industry as well. Is there more opportunity? Yes, there probably is, to be working more closely together. I think there's also great opportunities to continue to work with our unions as well around how we work with our
So we're
members.
getting away from that siloed approach that New Zealand's been sort of guilty of in years gone by.
And again, taking that approach that we're all in this together, right? That you don't have to be experts to talk about health and wellbeing and to help each other. And that actually we've got a shared care kind of responsibility to work together. I think, that's. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't actually specifically for you.
Yeah.
And truck driving was just an example, but I mean, I think just across the board, how many SMEs there are, how many one-person businesses there are. It is a collective responsibility for sorting them out, but how do we
Yeah, I mean, these issues are, supply chain issues, and there's certainly increasingly conversations with sector leadership, health and safety leadership groups around how well are you managing. So when we talk about individual job design, we can also talk about contract or supply chain design as well, to make sure that there's some responsibility taken for understanding the risks inherent within the way in which a particular supply chain is structured.
Yes.
I think it's possibly quite a relatively simple question, but I've worked for the international humanitarian and development sector for probably about 16 years, and internationally there's been some fantastic work in civil society around safeguarding, largely in response to the issues in the UK and the reports there around protecting workers and the recipients of our work from sexual exploitation, harassment and the like. Bringing it back to the New Zealand context, I just wonder, is the level of bullying and the lack of well-being in the workplace in New Zealand, how much do you think it's down to a good old-fashioned lack of courageous decision-making at the senior leadership level? Inability to perhaps call out their own peers on some of the stuff, protection of their position and the like. So,
Yeah, there's been some interesting research, but I might misquote it horribly, but there's a Don't Walk By type initiative happening, I think, in Australia. We're trying to basically pick up the responsibility of the observer or the co-worker or the passerby to call out the behaviour. And I believe that's been quite effective. I don't know, can you recall what it is?
Not off the top of my head, but undoubtedly it plays a role. And I think you're right about this. When we would talk about this, well, in fact, Andrea Needham, for those of you who are aware of her, who really put bullying on the public radar in New Zealand, talked about that not only do those that are experiencing bullying and witnessing bullying need to have the courage to speak up, but managers also need to have the courage to do something about it. And what we find is that often at the SLT level, they're quite engaged and quite prepared to do it. The difficulty is often in the middle or the first line supervisor. And the research that looks at sort of the HR or those with HR responsibilities and why it's so difficult. A lot of managers, HR will say that bullying is often one of the most difficult things they have to manage. Why? Because it takes a lot of time, it's really complicated, it's just yuck. And they need, why do they find it? Because they report, well, they don't actually have a lot of confidence to deal with it, they don't actually have the skills to deal with it, and so the easiest way is to not deal with it and kind of hope it goes away. So actually having courage to be able to do something about it, it does actually take a lot of courage. And one way to make it, having to have less courage, as it were, is to make sure that those managers do have the skills and the tools so that they do feel more confident to have a difficult conversation with someone, to have the courage to go up against a senior manager and say, dude, I don't think you're behaving in a way that's professional, and be prepared to confront it as well.
So what I'd add to that is the best protection is elimination, and the best method of elimination is creating the positive workplace culture. One of the challenges that we find is that harassment, bullying, and violence is on a spectrum. And we're all pretty clear when, pretty much, when something needs to go to the police, right? And then many workplaces, when dealing with allegations of harassment, bullying and so on, they frame it with an employment relationship issue. It becomes seen as an adversarial employment rights lens, which is a lens. From the Health and Safety at Work Act, any of those acts on the whole spectrum are health and safety incidents. So there is a choice in the way that, building cultures around being able to bring things forward and so on to, in terms of how you deal with something. Back to the comment made about most workers want to be in work. Being in work is generally better for you than not being in work. Obviously, being in good work is what we want. So connecting people into an adversarial approach may not be the best outcome for them. I was just sneaking a peek at my colleague's notes there, and he had this wonderful thing right at the beginning, which I might get you to talk about, but it's really important to think, what's the best outcome for the worker here? They want to be in work. They want the bullying to stop. They want the person to say sorry, and they want to make sure, they can get back to just doing the job so they can go home and have their life. So I'm just going to point out that point you make. So I think it's a really good one.
I think you have to.
I suspected that bullying might be kind of a topic of conversation today because it is fundamental to our wellbeing at work, right? And I did make a few notes. One of them I did have here was, act promptly because delays cause anxiety. And I think that's what your point there is, that when you hear of bullying case and somebody reports it to you, don't sit on it, as a leader or a manager. Don't sit on those things, because just by sitting on something, you're not doing something right. It's not what you say, it's what you do, right?
One of the tests of that is where in a business, and we're largely talking about large organisations with capacity, let alone the SME and the corner dairy, where in a business does the HR function sit? Is it up near the senior managers, or it's somewhere off the side? Again, I'm old enough to remember when there was the personnel officer who you could go and tell, Alice has got a drinking problem, things aren't good at home, and the dog ran away, so I'm going to be a bit difficult this week. Too often now, HR in some employers becomes the defence of the status quo, becomes the tool to protect the organisation. And even the challenge of the bullying letter, because bullying can be peer on peer, dear Alistair, we have had a report that you've done something. And it doesn't stop there. It then says, if this found to be true, we're going to take you out and shoot you. As opposed to, let's come and have a chat. And that's an art, not a science, and good employers walk that carefully. But that again assumes you're a large organisation where HR is where you are. HR is accessible. If you're working the 3 a.m. shift at Watties or at Ryman Healthcare, there's a different question of access. And then there's the question of confidence and assertiveness.
Yeah, so I'd just challenge that a little bit to... wouldn't it be better if there was a culture where the person can actually talk to their supervisor? All those things you mentioned, all those examples, as a leader myself, I need to be supporting my staff. I need them to be feeling confident they can have exactly those conversations with me. Why? Because I'm the person who can do something about it.
Ideally,
and so I
yes,
take that
not
responsibility.
if I don't have a supervisor, or the supervisor doesn't work on my shift, or I simply don't,
Who do I talk to?
Exactly. And that's, if HR is the lean bit that's tacked on to the business as an afterthought, as opposed to the integral part that says actually values and care, and what every business's greatest resource is its staff, even if you're a gold miner.
So we've talked about job design and workplace design to an extent, but what we're essentially touching on now is structural design of our companies and our jobs. Do we need to be confronting the hierarchies that we're working in our companies? If we've got HR happening up here and the workers here, do we think we need to have a fresh look at the way our companies are structured? Does anyone?
Well, you couldn't be a Wellingtonian who is either worked in or has a friend working in the public service, and every time there's a new chief executive, they restructure. Because that's what they're there to do. And so from a public sector point of view, we need to be really having a look at that, because it sends some dreadful signals. Probably the private sector, changes in management at Fonterra are probably much less dramatic than at the National Government Department.
I wanted to touch on something you said, Jude, about how we know for sure that you'd report something to the police. Because while you were talking, I recalled hearing an interchange, I'm not sure if anyone else heard it, between Anne Tolley and Winston Peters. And she was questioned about it, and he was speaking to her in a most abhorrent way. But she was condoning it to an extent, saying, no, robust conversations should be allowed. And I thought, goodness, if we let things slip so that we can essentially yell at each other, talk over one another, and that's acceptable in a public setting, our politicians at our highest level, what are we to glean from that as a worker bee? Do we think standards are slipping? Are they allowed to slip? Should we be calling that sort of behaviour out?
Have you ever watched Parliament TV?
Yeah. My point, exactly. I mean, that's an example of that. But is that okay just because it happens?
No, but politics attracts certain types of types of personalities, and that's how they are. I won't comment too much.
Which is why the Francis Review intrigues me, because we are dealing with a unique situation, or is it indicative of what's happening on a broader scale in New Zealand?
Well, I'd be interested to ask my fellow panellists here, what kind of frameworks do we have that invite certain types of leaders? Are we positioning certain types of personalities to be leaders that are loud, brash, and pushing them to be bullies, or are we allowing more considered, quieter people to move into those positions as well?
Is that for?
Any
That's
thoughts
for anyone.
on that?
Yeah.
Would anyone like to take that? Terry?
Well,
I think the definition of
we?
leader is changing. It feels to me like the definition of leader is changing. I think the definition of leader nowadays is changing to a much diverse kind of thinking, in terms of not only female-male ratios, but also ethnicities as well, and making sure we get that right. And businesses are concerned about it, getting diversity right, so that we don't get that kind of, we don't get stale, I guess, and that we don't get groupthink, and that we don't get a certain culture within the organisation prevailing. I think that's important, and that we challenge that. So, yeah, I think that's changing. I don't think we're necessarily there yet, right? Because, we're still obviously seeing harassment and bullying playing out in our organisations, and I guess that's one lever to pull, right, is diversity, making sure that we've got different people, different mixes within our team, so there's different viewpoints and what becomes reasonable.
We haven't talked about cultural responsiveness in all of this. How highly does that rate in our workplaces? Terry.
Organisational culture. Is that what you mean?
Yes,
organisational culture.
Cultural responsiveness in terms of different ethnicities, and how we, what well-being looks like to this person would look differently to this person in terms of their values and.
I think the key thing is just not taking that one-size-fits-all approach to health and well-being at work, and that you are making sure that you're talking to your audience, that you understand how the organisation ticks, and that you understand the culture of the organisation to be able to really then respond to what the needs are. Because I know that the needs, for example, at WorkSafe work environment are going to be quite different from those within Fonterra, which is primarily in the sort of agricultural manufacturing sector, right? So we're going to have different needs, and I think making sure that we respond to the needs of the work population that we have. So that's probably the only thing I could say to you.
Great, thank you. Yes.
I have a question really probably directed to you, WorkSafe. New Zealand-based research, workplace research. A lot of our mental health is statistically across the world has been determined on the illness-based recovery of information. And yet we know that work is good for you. So I'm interested as to where in the future we're going so that our statistics direct some of our interventions for the future.
Yeah, it's a really great question. We actually have partnered with the Health Research Centre, is it? Council. So that's the wrong C word, isn't it? HRC, I always refer to them as. And actually just closed some RFPs for looking at psychosocial harm interventions. So we're hoping to be able to contribute to the body of research and working with Massey University in terms of the worker exposure survey and also on the barometer. So we're mindful that our knowledge and understanding for work-related health has been, it's very challenging, and it's a lot of WorkSafe's activity was based on ACC data, which is limited to injury data and what their scheme will cover. And we have been putting a lot of energy into supplementing and understanding work-related health harm. And just to share with you that, how many people do you think die every year from an injury, an accident? So less than 100, right? Sort of maybe 60, call it. How many people do you think die every year from harm to their health caused by work? Heaps, that's a good answer. So it's about 800 to 1,000 people every year dying because of harm caused by work. But I can't tell you which people, because that's actually a statistical piece of work that has taken us quite a lot of time to recalculate. However, we do understand within that how many people we might expect have got cancer that's caused from work. The problem is identifying, from the vast majority of cancers, they've got multiple ways in which it could have been caused. There's very few cancers, so mesothelioma from the asbestos is one of the few that you can link to work. So we're looking at doing quite a lot of work in the coming years to continue to understand the causes of harm, triangulate what we know from overseas to what's being reported as an exposure in the workplace, and then working with others to shape some intervention programs. So we know elimination's always got to be the best solution, and then, identification, then elimination, and then management. So I don't know if I really answered your question, except to say really mindful that there's a lot more work to do.
Is your head turned towards Canada because they're doing some good work?
I'll talk to you afterwards and find out if I've
So part of what we're
right
trying to do with the barometer project is with organisations trying to show the not only the negative outcomes of having a poor psychosocial climate, the bullying, the stress and all that kind of stuff, but also a sense of what are the positive outcomes of having a good psychosocial, so engagement, inclusion, perceptions of productivity, so that organisations can understand if they can work on interventions to, we're going on a bit of a thing about psychosocial safety climate. So if they can improve the psychosocial safety climate, not only are they managing the bad things, but they're also getting these positive outcomes as well.
I think there's also opportunity when we talk about research, because often to get really good empirical research, we have to do large randomised controlled trials that are very expensive, right? But I'm really impressed with some of the research that you guys are doing in that it doesn't have to be complex when we use the word research. It can be just about sharing our stories around what's working for us in our own environments, and then hey, maybe it'll work over here and maybe it'll work over there. And I'm looking at colleagues in the audience thinking, hey, look, there's stuff that we've been doing and sharing across, I guess, business and as well as through government departments that we probably, 10, 20 years ago that we never really did before. But what I'm starting to see is that real generation of ideas and sharing stories and things that we can do that'll make a difference. I guess practice-based examples.
Yes.
I got a slightly different question. Initially for Alistair and Alex, and then maybe debate from others. Alistair, you particularly talked about regulatory situation and the 80s compared to now. If there could be one improvement in regulations to better protect workers from say, in terms of bullying or psychosocial health, what's one improvement that you'd like to see? And then maybe, Alex, what's something that you would potentially like to see in terms of...
Sure, I think the removal of fear at work, despite the initial position of the Labour and the Green Party, we still have the dreadfulness of the 90-day fire at will trial, and particularly for young people in employers of less than 20, which is the first line experience for tens of thousands of people, the fact that for those first 90 days you can be sacked with no notice. Fear at work, that would be a small, modest step that tragically the Coalition couldn't agree on.
And you're interested in possible ways to regulate technology? So I've heard anecdotally that some programmers, designers that design games like Candy Crush and Instagram, they refer to themselves as addiction squads. And these are people that have worked in the casino industry and learnt how to create slot machines and make them as addictive as possible. I would like to see apps that are designed for children, those practices to be banned. I think for people who are, so I know that's going outside this conversation on wellbeing in the workplace, but for people whose brains are forming and who are particularly vulnerable to these tactics of persuasion, I think there needs to be a real conversation around at what age should you be exposed to it. Yeah.
That actually leads quite nicely. I know we've talked, your comment about making apps for children. At what point does this wellbeing conversation really start? I mean, are we doing enough in our schools to promote these ideals that we're talking about, this gold standard, so that when young people reach the workplace, they have a clear idea of expectations around there's a no tolerance culture to bullying, for example. Do you think we've got room to improve in that respect?
Well, just to start the conversation here, I think we have to be ready that the next generation of workers are digital natives. They do not know a life before Wi-Fi and smartphones. And so whereas I can remember dial-up internet and they don't. And so their expectations around sociability, connecting, disconnecting will be completely different, and we have to be prepared to change our standards with a different workforce. Not
to take a dystopian view, but I mean, given that their relationship with and you mentioned it before about everything you say online, it stays with you, that's the environment they're in, and I speak as a mother of an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old who are entering that world of digital media. Do you think there's even more need to take a firmer stance on these?
I think we need to be very critical of these tech companies. At the same time, the term techno-stress was first used in 1984. And I mean to emphasise it came from the 80s, not from that particular year and the Orwell book. So we have been dealing with new technologies for over 30 years in terms of the impact on our wellbeing. And so there is always an element of moral panic with every single new technology that comes along. And unfortunately, you cannot tell what is genuine moral panic and what is a genuine concern until some of the noise has dissipated. And so I think we're going to have to sit with this one for a bit and teach our children our own values and standards and be critical of the platforms that create these addictive platform technologies.
I mean, I absolutely agree that we, us, our society, we want an intergenerational change, right? We want people to care. I was really thrilled that the care word was used because that's what it's about, caring about your workers, caring about people. And when we care, then we will put effort into making sure we've got the right conditions. Now, as a society, if our younger people are embracing the concept of caring, they're certainly prepared to stand up and say they're caring for our planet, maybe that change will come through. And we do know that there are some entrenched attitudes when people say, I've been doing the same thing for 30, 40, 50 years and nothing bad's ever happened to me. As I just said, it's not about the accident. There's other stuff happening to your body as a consequence of work that you might not see today. So I'd say yes, wouldn't it be marvellous if we could eliminate bullying in the wider society, at school. I think it's less likely that we're going to see it at work.
Good answer. Any final questions from the floor? Oh, we've covered everything. Let's wrap up then, shall we, with, I'd like it if each panellist, we'll start with you, Alistair, we'll work our way down, could give their sort of takeaway points from this evening, any new ideas you've had along the course of the way, or parting words.
Well, I think my parting word is remember what we've lost, because the goodwill and the araha that comes through this conversation is looking around the room where I think the average age is 25. The 25-year-olds don't remember what we lost, and actually we need to be fighting, and I mean fighting, to claim back the dignity for the workforce.
Thank you.
I think organisations and people have a generally good understanding of physical health, physical fitness, and we create work environments that are conducive to allowing people to be healthy, physically healthy. We have fruit and bowls, we have showers so people can exercise during work or to and fro work. What would an environment that would be conducive to mental health look like?
Good point. Excellent. Take that as a rhetorical.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, that was rhetorical.
Yeah, I was waiting for the answer. I guess my only comment is to thank people for taking part in a conversation about lifting our performance for health and safety. So thank you.
Thank you. Terry?
Yeah, a key message for me, I think, is that it is, that shared care environment that we should be fostering, that you don't have to be an expert to help each other, and that we should be all thinking about our colleagues, I guess, in the workplace and as humans, and colleagues, and just in that way. Don't worry too much about the boundaries, but all be not frightened of having that wellbeing conversation with each other.
Thank you. Bevan?
So, yeah, I guess sustainable and meaningful work, has lots and lots of positive, effects. And also, as we've been talking about, work can also have lots of negatives in terms of things we've been talking about today, stress and bullying and so on and so forth. What I'm, I guess, becoming a little bit concerned about, particularly when we're talking about bullying, that we don't want to overemphasise secondary prevention, which I'm sort of seeing a little bit in the media. So, we need to change pieces of legislation and all that kind of stuff. Primary prevention is equally where we should be putting a lot of emphasis, because it's a lot better off if we have positive, healthy work, rather than, worrying about how we're going to manage, bullying cases. Because once they get to the stage where they become complaints, and complex ones, no one wins.
Thank you. Jude's really said it for me, actually. Thank you for being part of the conversation. I think having the conversation is just as important as anything, really. So, and do watch Health Central for the follow-ups of this, and we'll keep that conversation, the dialogue going. To our wonderful panel, thank you. I couldn't thank you enough for being part of it, and I've learnt a lot and been inspired, so appreciate you giving up your time tonight, and if we could give a round of applause for our panellists. Thank you all for coming.
Kia ora.